Now to our other big story at 5. Jarvis Butts, the man convicted of killing 13-year-old Ziyah Harris and sexually assaulting her and other girls, is dead after weeks after being sentenced. His body found at a prison intake center in Jackson.
Breaking news, the man accused of killing 13-year-old Ziyah Harris has pleaded guilty. Jarvis Butts pleaded guilty to her murder as well as 5 separate sexual assault cases of 4 different minors. Ziyah was last seen getting off her school bus in Detroit back in January 2024.
It's ragu and butter. I seen it on TikTok, so I'm about to see how it tastes. Good.
It was a January afternoon in Detroit. Cold, gray, ordinary. A 13-year-old girl stepped off her school bus at the corner of Cornwall Street and 3 Mile Drive on Detroit's east side. The same corner she'd stepped off at before. The same route home she'd taken 100 times. She never made it home. Her name was Ziyah Harris. She was a 7th grader at J.E. Clark Preparatory Academy. She wanted to be a teacher someday. She was described by everyone who knew her as full of life, always smiling, always willing to help someone in need. She was 13 years old. And what investigators would eventually uncover about the man who took her, what they found on his phone, in his search history, and embedded in text messages exchanged over more than a year, painted a picture so disturbing that even seasoned prosecutors struggled to find the right words. This is not just the story of a missing girl. This is the story of a predator who hid in plain sight, who used family trust as a weapon, who was reported to authorities, not once, not twice, but at least 5 times and was never stopped, until it was too late. Welcome to Real True Crime 24/7. May you and your family stay safe wherever you are. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, because we bring you the parts the media never reported. Her name was Ziyah Harris, but to the people who loved her, her family, her classmates, her neighbors on Detroit's east side, she was simply Ziyah. A name said with warmth, a name said with the specific tenderness that people reserve for children they cherish. She was 13 years old when she disappeared on January 9th, 2024. By all accounts, she was a girl who carried a light around with her. Her mother described her as full of life, always smiling, and always willing to help someone in need. Those are not the words of a grieving parent reaching for something to say. Those are the words of someone who knew a specific child, her quirks, her laughter.
So, what's up, y'all?
Her way of moving through the world, and who is now left holding only the memory of it. She was a 7th grader at J.E. Clark Preparatory Academy, a school on Detroit's east side. She had aspirations. She wanted to become a teacher. A child who had not yet figured out the full shape of who she would be, but who had already started pointing herself towards something purposeful, something that would allow her to give back. Think about that for a moment. A 13-year-old who looks at the world and says, I want to teach. I want to be the person in the front of the room who makes things make sense for other kids. That is not ambition born of ego. That is empathy. The specific kind that makes you want to reach back and pull someone else forward. Ziyah lived with her grandmother and guardian, Annette Harris, on Detroit's east side. Her life, from the outside, looked like the life of thousands of children across this city. School, home, family. The ordinary rhythms that most people take for granted until they are suddenly, violently gone. But what was happening inside Ziyah's life, what had been happening since at least 2022, when she was just 11 years old, was anything but ordinary. And by the time the people who were supposed to protect her figured out what was wrong, Ziyah Harris was already gone. To understand what happened to Ziyah, you need to understand how Jarvis Butts gained access to her. Because it didn't happen through a stranger in a parking lot. It didn't happen through a random online encounter. It happened through the front door. Through family. Jarvis Butts was the long-term partner of Ziyah's aunt, Shannon Harris. He had 5 children with Shannon, which means he was, in the most practical sense, a fixture in the lives of Ziyah's extended family.
Yeah. Happy birthday. Hey, Jarvisa. You'll be out of town. Come on.
Daddy! Look at the day!
Hey, happy
Come on, sweetheart. Say thank you.
Thanks, man.
Y'all come on down this way.
Hey, Ziyah, look at mine.
He was at gatherings, he was familiar, he was known, he was trusted. And Butts, who by this point had already been convicted of a sex offense in 2004 and served 7 years in prison, used that trust to do what prosecutors say he had done before. And before that, and before that. He found a woman, got close to her family, and then targeted her children. Investigators later determined that Butts had a deliberate pattern. He would befriend or romantically pursue women, he would establish himself as a presence in their households, and then he would turn his attention to their daughters, children who had been taught to see him as a trusted adult, which made them uniquely vulnerable to the manipulation that followed. Ziyah was 11 years old when it started. Prosecutors said that by September 2022, Butts had begun sending Ziyah text messages of a sexually explicit nature. 11 years old. He also co-owned an auto repair shop in Detroit, and Ziyah was reportedly seen there frequently. Her cousin, who was 9 years old at the time of the preliminary hearing in January 2025, testified that on at least 2 separate occasions, Butts took her and Ziyah and another child to that shop. She testified that she witnessed Butts sexually assault Ziyah there. She also testified that Butts tried to do the same to her, and that she said no. A 9-year-old child, sitting in a witness stand, describing what she saw. The text continued. By March 2023, according to Detroit Police Sergeant Shannon Jones' testimony at the preliminary hearing, Butts was sending Ziyah messages that read, "Stop messing with people and just be mine, and I can't stop thinking about you either." He was a grown man. He was in his 40s. She was 12 years old. By September 2023, Ziyah sent Butts a text telling him she had not had her period. The evidence indicates that by November 2023, 2 months before she disappeared, Butts knew she was pregnant. He knew. And prosecutors say that what followed next was the moment this case crossed from abuse into something even darker. He began searching online for ways to end the pregnancy. In criminal investigations, the digital trail is often the most honest witness in the room. Phones don't lie. Search histories don't have lawyers, and what was recovered from electronic devices associated with Jarvis Butts was, according to prosecutors, devastating. Investigators found suspicious Google searches on those devices dating back to December 2023, a full month before Ziyah disappeared. Among the searches, herbal abortion teas, abortion pills, and, perhaps most chilling of all, drinking red antifreeze. Let that sink in. A man who had gotten a 13-year-old girl pregnant was searching for ways to terminate that pregnancy without involving a doctor, a clinic, or anyone who might ask questions. He was looking for methods that could be administered without the girl's knowledge or consent. Methods that, in the case of antifreeze, can be fatal. The judge who presided over the preliminary hearing, Judge Aliyah Sabri of the 36th District Court, was explicit about what she believed this evidence pointed to. She said from the bench, it appears he intended to perform what he thought was a do-it-yourself abortion on Ziyah, and it went south. And instead of seeking medical attention for her, he intentionally killed her and tried his best to cover it up. A judge, saying those words, out loud, in a courtroom. That is not a legal opinion delivered in the careful, hedged language of someone trying to stay neutral. That is a judge who looked at the totality of the evidence and called it what it was. Butts was also, prosecutors noted, facing a looming legal problem of his own. He was scheduled to turn himself in on a separate gun charge on January 9, 2024, the exact same day Ziyah disappeared. That date had been pushed back to February. But the pressure of that pending legal case was closing in. A pregnant 13-year-old whose testimony could have dismantled what remained of his freedom was a liability he apparently decided he could not afford. January 9th, 2024. Detroit. A Wednesday. Ziyah Harris woke up and went to school. A 7th grader on a Wednesday morning. She had her school-issued tablet with her. At some point during the school day, she used that tablet to send messages to a device associated with Jarvis Butts. Prosecutors said the messages confirmed they would meet after school. She was 12, almost 13. He was 41, with a prior sex conviction, a pending gun charge, and the knowledge that the child he had been abusing for 2 years was carrying his child. Surveillance footage captured Ziyah leaving school. That footage would become one of the most studied pieces of evidence in the case. She met Butts after school, along with a coworker of his. The three of them went to Butts's auto repair shop. Ziyah was reportedly seen there by Butts's sister, Tiwana Butts, who would later testify at the sentencing hearing that she saw a girl she didn't recognize getting out of her brother's truck between 4:30 and 6 p.m. that day. She would say she had no reason to be alarmed. She didn't know who Ziyah was. She thought she was someone else's niece. From the shop, Butts, the coworker, and Ziyah drove to Ypsilanti, Michigan. Phone data placed Butts at those locations. The three then returned to Detroit, where Butts checked into a motel. Ziyah Harris was never seen again after that. Back on Detroit's east side at around 6 p.m., Ziyah's grandmother and guardian, Annette Harris, learned her granddaughter hadn't come home from school. She looked around for her. She waited. She waited until the following morning, January 10th, to report Ziyah missing. The judge at the preliminary hearing, Judge Sabri, found that detail troubling. She was pointed about it in her ruling, noting with visible frustration that a grandmother had waited overnight before calling the police about a missing 13-year-old. She also asked, publicly from the bench, how two women in that household, both of whom had children of their own, had failed to notice that Ziyah was pregnant. "I don't know who else failed Ziyah," Sabri said, "but the community did." Those words have stayed with many people who followed this case. They weren't an accusation directed at a specific individual. They were a reckoning. A judge publicly naming what the evidence was making impossible to ignore, that Ziyah Harris had been failed repeatedly by the world around her. Here is something that has not been widely discussed in most coverage of this case. The Detroit Public Schools Community District launched its own missing persons investigation on January 10, 2024. The day after Ziyah disappeared. The school system investigated for more than a month before hitting a wall and handing the case to the Detroit Police Department on February 14, 2024. More than 5 weeks passed before the Detroit Police Department took over the active investigation. On February 15th, the day after the transfer, Detective Jason Mays and his partner sat down with Jarvis Butts for an interview. Butts told them he'd had a legal issue on the day Ziyah went missing. He described Ziyah as a relative of one of his daughters who would occasionally come to his auto shop. He was calm. He was cooperative in the way that practiced liars often are. He gave them a story that, on the surface, explained everything and confirmed nothing. He wasn't arrested that day. The investigation continued through the spring and summer of 2024. Police searched a pond near Grayshit Avenue and Quinn Road in Clinton Township. They searched the area around 7 Mile and Berg Road near the Rouge River. It was at that second location, near 7 Mile and Berg, that searchers made a significant discovery. A pink jumpsuit, turned inside out, a black jacket, a black hoodie with headphones still in the pocket, a single red and black Nike shoe. A U.S. Border Patrol agent who was assisting in the search testified later that the clothing had not been there long. No discoloration, no animal damage. He described it as looking fresh. And here's a detail that didn't make many headlines. Both Ziyah's and Butts's DNA were found on that black hoodie. Then, on March 7, 2024, a woman in the neighborhood found something lying face down on the sidewalk near her home on 7 Mile and Evergreen. She stepped over it for 2.5 weeks before she finally picked it up. When she turned it over, she recognized the name from the news. It was Ziyah Harris's school ID. The woman took the bus to a local gas station, set the ID on a lid to prevent further fingerprints, and called the police. By August 15, 2024, Detroit police submitted a warrant request in connection with Ziyah's disappearance. By September 26th, Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy stood before cameras and announced that Jarvis Butts had been charged with Ziyah's murder, even though her body had never been found. There is one more detail in the timeline of this investigation that has received almost no attention. Detroit police had received an alert from Child Protective Services in 2022, a law enforcement network notification naming Jarvis Butts and a sexual abuse allegation involving a minor. That alert sat in the system. According to reporting by WXYZ, Detroit police never opened an investigation into that specific allegation. When confronted about it, Assistant Chief Charles Fitzgerald told journalist Ross Jones, "We just didn't do enough with it. We could have done better, no question." He said the department had since implemented new policies to prevent the same failure from happening again. The question that nobody has fully answered is, what would have happened to Ziyah Harris if that 2022 allegation had been properly investigated? Jarvis Butts was named in at least 5 separate Child Protective Services complaints between 2015 and 2023. 5. The complaints spanned nearly a decade. They came from different people, relatives, neighbors, people in his orbit who had seen enough to be afraid. They alleged concerns about molestation, physical abuse, and dangerous living conditions. One complaint filed in 2022 specifically alleged that Butts had inappropriately touched Ziyah Harris. CPS investigated some of the complaints. They conducted a face-to-face interview with Butts in June 2022, following that specific allegation about Ziyah. According to internal records obtained by 7 News Detroit, Butts strongly denied the allegation during that interview. CPS could not confirm to reporters whether they ever questioned Ziyah herself about what had been reported. They cited state and federal privacy law. One of the relatives who filed a complaint, Kawana Morton, told 7 News that she had told CPS explicitly, "I'm 90% sure that there's sexual abuse going on within the home." She named Butts directly. She was not contacted again after filing. Another relative, Jernell, filed a complaint after children at a party reported that Butts had touched them. She submitted it by phone. She was told they would reach out if needed. They didn't. None of the 5 complaints resulted in legal consequences for Jarvis Butts. And just over a year after the last complaint on record, Ziyah Harris was missing. "I'm brokenhearted," Kawana Morton said, "because this could have been prevented. All of it." Those 4 words, "all of it could have been prevented," are perhaps the most important words in this entire case. Not the charges, not the sentence, not the headline, those 4 words. Because that is not a grieving relative reaching for something to say. That is a person who filed a report, followed the rules, trusted the system, and watched the system do nothing. The preliminary examination in the Ziyah Harris murder case began on January 6, 2025, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Ziyah disappeared. It lasted 4 to 5 days and produced some of the most detailed and some of the most disturbing courtroom testimony this case had seen. Prosecutor Matthew Makepeace walked the court through the digital evidence, the sexually explicit texts that began when Ziyah was 11, the messages in September 2023 confirming she'd missed her period, the searches in December 2023 for herbal abortion teas, abortion pills, and antifreeze. A Michigan State Police crime lab technician testified that both Ziyah's and Butts' DNA had been recovered from the black hoodie found near the Rouge River. Butts' co-worker and his sister both placed him with Ziyah on the afternoon she disappeared. Phone data tracked him to Ypsilanti and back to Detroit, and then placed his phone near 7 Mile and Berg Road between 11:40 p.m. on January 10th and 1:34 a.m. on January 11th. The same stretch of riverbank where Ziyah's clothing was later found. And then there was Ziyah's 9-year-old cousin on the witness stand, describing what she had seen at Butts' auto shop, describing the moment he turned toward her, describing how she said no. On January 9th, 2025, the 1-year anniversary of Ziyah's disappearance, Judge Aaliyah Sabry delivered her ruling. She found sufficient evidence to send the case to trial on the first-degree murder charge, but it was what she said beyond the ruling that people who were in that courtroom remember. She called Butts a monster. She called Ziyah's grandmother's testimony questionable. She asked openly how 2 women in the household had missed the signs of a pregnant 13-year-old. She spoke about the auto shop, about the fact that Ziyah was repeatedly sent there, and what that access had allowed. And she gave the court her assessment of what she believed had happened in Butts' motel room on the night of January 9th and into the early hours of January 10th, 2024. A do-it-yourself abortion. Gone wrong. And then a choice. Not to get help, not to call an ambulance, but to cover it up. She said Ziyah deserved so much more. She was right. On February 12, 2026, 13 days before his trial was scheduled to begin, Jarvis Butts walked into Wayne County Circuit Court and entered guilty pleas in 6 separate cases. 6 cases. 1 count of second-degree murder in the killing of Ziyah Harris. 4 counts of second-degree criminal sexual conduct. 1 count of third-degree criminal sexual conduct. The victims in the sexual assault cases ranged in age from 4 years old to 13. One of those children was an 8-year-old family member. Another was the 4-year-old daughter of a girlfriend, a child who prosecutors said had contracted chlamydia as a result of the assault. The original first-degree murder charge, which carried a mandatory life sentence, was dropped as part of the agreement. So were the charges of child sexually abusive commercial activity and 2 counts of sexual assault of Ziyah specifically. Some people were angry about that, understandably. But there was something in the plea agreement that went beyond the sentence. As a condition of pleading guilty to second-degree murder, Jarvis Butts was required to provide a truthful statement about what he had done with Ziyah's body. A source told Local 4 that Butts admitted to dumping her remains in the Rouge River near the intersection of 7 Mile and Berg, the same stretch of riverbank where her clothing had been found 2 years earlier. Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy confirmed after sentencing that Butts had provided that statement and that it had been shared with the family. She said she was satisfied with what he had given them, She said it had brought some semblance of closure to some members of Ziyah's family. The statement was not made public. Ziyah's body has still not been recovered. Jarvis Butts arrived at the Wayne County 3rd Circuit Court on March 12, 2026, wearing a green jail inmate uniform, a paper mask over his nose and mouth, and shackles on his arms and legs. Several uniformed officers surrounded him. Judge Nicholas Hathaway noted the security presence before the hearing began. The courtroom was packed. What followed, over the next several hours, was one of the most emotionally charged sentencing hearings in recent Wayne County memory. 7 victim impact statements. 7 people walking to a microphone and speaking into the face of the man who had done this. Ziyah's grandmother, Annette Harris, was the first to speak. She sobbed through her statement. While she was still seated at the microphone, someone in the gallery yelled at her to shut up. Multiple people were escorted out of the courtroom by officers amid the commotion. Ziyah's aunt, Marquetta Harris, did not hold back. She asked Judge Hathaway to give Butts the electric chair. "A life for a life," she said. She called him a serial habitual predator. She told him what he had taken from her, the ability to hold her niece, to listen to her, to see her smile. "I'll never get to have that chance ever again," she said, "because of you. It hurts." One of the girls Butts had sexually assaulted had her sister read her statement while she sat beside her in the witness stand. She was wearing sparkly black shoes. She described what Butts had done to her when she was 4 years old and the years of pain that followed. She expressed fear that he would abuse again even after release. "Let his consequences be so no other child faces what I had," her statement said. Another survivor echoed the sentiment and added a detail that stopped the room. "Mr. Butts was already a convicted sex offender when he abused me in 2014. Despite knowing the harm and having every opportunity to stop, he continued to abuse children. He was looking at his feet for most of it." Butts' own sister, Tijuana, also addressed the court. She spoke about the day she saw Ziyah at the auto shop, the girl she didn't recognize getting out of her brother's truck. She said she had no reason to be alarmed that day. She wished there had been a sign. And then she turned her words outward, toward the community. "There are many Ziyahs out there. We need to do better as a family in protecting our children from monsters." His criminal history, the court was reminded, went back to 1997. Judge Nicholas Hathaway sentenced Jarvis Butts to 35 to 60 years in prison for the murder of Ziyah Harris, an additional 10 to 15 years on each of the 5 sexual assault charges to be served concurrently. He will not be eligible for parole until 2061. He was led out in shackles on the morning of Thursday, March 26, 2026. 14 days after his sentencing, Jarvis Butts was found unresponsive in his cell at the Charles Eggeler Reception and Guidance Center in Jackson, Michigan. MDRC staff attempted life-saving measures. They were unsuccessful. Jarvis Butts was pronounced dead that morning. He was 43 years old. Michigan State Police were called to investigate. The death is currently being reported as a suicide. He had been at Eggeler, the reception and processing facility for newly sentenced inmates entering the Michigan Department of Corrections, for less than 2 weeks. Under normal circumstances, he would have been transferred to a long-term facility once the intake process was complete. He never made it. Reactions to his death were complicated. For some, it was a form of justice, or at least a form of ending. A man who had terrorized children across decades, who had evaded accountability for far too long, who had walked free while the warnings piled up, was gone. For others, it felt like a door slamming shut on questions that would never fully be answered. A family friend and former Detroit Board of Police Commissioners Vice President Tamara Liberty Smith put it directly, "I feel like justice hasn't been served." Ziyah's cousin Roxy, who had been one of the most visible advocates in the public fight for answers, spoke about what the news meant to the other survivors in the case. She said she had spoken to one of them the day Butts died, and that survivor had told her, "I can finally breathe. I've been suffocated for so many years." The Detroit Police Department issued a statement confirming they were aware of Butts' death and that despite the conviction, their work was not done. They said they would continue searching for Ziyah's body, following all leads, pursuing every avenue that might bring her home to her family. As of this recording, Ziyah Harris has not been found. We promised you the parts the media didn't fully cover. Here they are. Jarvis Butts was convicted of a sex offense in 2004, having sex with a child, and served 7 years in prison. He was released. He rebuilt a life that placed him again in proximity to children. His criminal history goes back to 1997. A man with a documented history of predatory behavior toward minors was living with and fathering children with a woman whose niece was in regular contact with him. The state knew who he was. The system knew his history. And yet the warnings that came after, 5 CPS complaints over 8 years, produced nothing. Prosecutors made a point of noting that Butts was scheduled to turn himself in on a separate gun charge on the exact day Ziyah disappeared, January 9, 2024. That date had been pushed to February. The theory prosecutors developed was that Ziyah's pregnancy represented an existential threat to him. A pregnant minor, if she came forward or if the pregnancy became visible, would have exposed everything. With a gun charge already pending and potentially more prison time ahead, investigators believed he calculated that silence was safer than a living witness. Both Ziyah's and Butts' DNA were recovered from the black hoodie found near the Rouge River. This evidence, which received far less attention than the text messages, was among the most forensically significant in the case. It physically placed them together at the location where her clothing was found, at a time and in circumstances that aligned precisely with the prosecution's theory of what happened on the night of January 10th. When the final pretrial conference was held in December 2025, prosecutors estimated they had approximately 80 potential witnesses ready to testify. The defense estimated 3. That asymmetry tells you everything about the strength of the case against Butts and the nature of the evidence that had been assembled over 2 years. In the end, he never let those 80 witnesses take the stand. He entered a guilty plea instead. As part of his plea agreement, Butts was required to make a truthful statement about what he had done with Ziyah's body. That statement was made privately, not in open court. The prosecutor said she was satisfied with it, but the public never heard it. The family has been given what they were given. Whether that is enough, Whether anything could ever be enough is a question only they can answer. Before we close, there is something that cannot be left unsaid. Ziyah Harris was not failed once. She was failed repeatedly by multiple systems across multiple years in ways that were not subtle and were not unknowable. The signs were there in 2015. They were there in 2022, when a CPS complaint named her specifically. They were there when a law enforcement alert was transmitted to the Detroit Police Department and filed without follow-up. They were there in the months before she disappeared, when she was 12 years old and pregnant, and apparently no one in her household had understood what was happening to her. Detroit Police Assistant Chief Charles Fitzgerald stood before a reporter and said, "We just didn't do enough with it. We could have done better, no question." That admission is important. But an admission is not the same as accountability, and accountability is not the same as change. Ziyah's cousin Roxy has announced plans to create the Ziyah Rapid Response Recovery Team, an advocacy organization designed to fight for families in cases like this one, to make noise when the system goes quiet, to make sure that missing Black children in Detroit receive the same urgency and resources as any other child. That work matters. That work is what Ziyah's story demands. Because here's the thing about this case that makes it different from so many others. The information to stop Jarvis Butts existed. Multiple people reported it. Multiple agencies received it. The thread was there. Someone just had to pull it. Nobody did. If you are watching this tonight and something in Ziyah's story feels familiar, if you know a child who is being groomed, or who has access to an adult who makes you uneasy, or who is receiving gifts and attention from someone that doesn't feel right, please report it. Call CPS, call local police, call the National Child Abuse Hotline. Document everything. Follow up. Don't assume someone else already called. Don't assume the system caught it, because in Ziyah's case, they got 5 calls, and they still didn't catch it. The National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453, around the clock. You do not need to be certain. You do not need proof. You just need to make the call. Ziyah Harris wanted to be a teacher. She wanted to stand at the front of a room and help children understand the world. She was 13 years old with decades of life ahead of her and a future that would never unfold. Her body is still somewhere in Detroit. Her family is still waiting to bring her home. Her killer is gone, but her story, the fullness of it, the failure of it, the tragedy of it, cannot be allowed to go with him. Say her name. Ziyah Harris. Rest in peace.